my friend Fida Adely, and she and I are friends because our older daughters have been friends since about 4th grade, I guess. And Fida is a professor of anthropology at Georgetown University, and she's going to speak about women in the Middle East. I'm just suddenly blanking out on. Yeah, she'll tell you that she grew up in Yonkers. She'll tell you a little bit about her family and how she came to be interested in the subject. Her parents are from Jordan, and I guess I will just feed it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for inviting me, Jane. Yeah, I look forward to having a discussion with you. So I do have a lot of notes, and I'm going to try to talk for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and then open it up for questions. But please feel free to ask me any questions if there's something unclear about what I'm saying. Because what I think I'm going to do is just kind of give a broad view of some of the socio-economic transformations in the region and how they've impacted women. And then the second part is really focusing on my own research in Jordan. So as an anthropologist, I do really kind of local grassroots research in schools, as well as amongst a particular group of women who've been migrating to the capital city. So I'll talk about my own research, but I want to just start kind of setting a broader context. But first, in terms of sort of how I came to this topic, so Jane mentioned that my parents are from Jordan, and so they immigrated here just a year before I was born. So I lived in a pretty significant Arab American community, mostly from Jordan, Palestine, Syria, and so kind of grew up learning about the region as an immigrant and through kind of the immigrant experience, and was quite surprised about my own assumptions about the region that had been formed by growing up in the US as an Arab American, and how some of those were kind of upset by my research, and maybe I'll talk about some examples. So as an undergrad, actually, I really resisted studying the Middle East. I sort of wanted nothing to do with it, but then ended up being a Middle East studies major. And then I didn't want to write about women, and then ended up writing a thesis on women at the urging of my advisor, and because I couldn't come up with a better topic, maybe, you know. But as an undergraduate, I was really kind of studying the region through the lens of political science. And even my thesis on women was about sort of the political significance of debates about women. And it was largely about kind of men's debates about women, historically and in the present, and kind of legal debates. And I looked at Algeria and Egypt and compared them. So I was kind of thinking about these issues at a very different level than I have come to understand them. And it's important for me to talk about this trajectory because it really explains sort of how my research is unfold and what I think is important for trying to understand women's status in the region and women's issues. Because they've always been part of these larger debates, and they were also part of kind of a colonial discourse about what was wrong in the region, and continues to be part of our own framing of the region. And in many ways, I think fuels a lot of anti-Islamic, anti-Arab bias in this country, the assumptions we have about the situation of women in the region. So that's sort of a starting point for me. And I also, have sort of shifted to anthropology. So I ended up doing my doctoral work in education and anthropology. I've always been interested in education, and I did a combined degree in education and anthropology because I was really interested in kind of the lived experience, right? How people are living in the region, what kind of meaning they attribute to their experiences. So I was interested in these larger structures, whether they be economic, political, religious, and how they define people's experiences and opportunities. But I believe strongly that people have agency in the context of those structures. All of our lives are shaped by some things that we don't have control over, but we all sort of work to try to navigate that and make sense of it, and sometimes embrace some of these structures. So that's kind of my philosophical starting point and what drew me to anthropology, which is really much concerned about kind of local perspectives and local experience. So I'm going to talk about these broad trends, but ultimately I'm really interested in kind of the specific experiences of particular groups of women. Whenever I'm asked what is the situation of women in the Arab world, or what is the situation of Muslim women, my response is, whether it's to my students or my neighbor, which women, where, under what conditions, right? Because just like women in the United States have very different experiences depending on their class, their race, where they live, whether it's urban or rural, all these factors shape the experience of women in the region. Also the region, and the Arab world, if I even more narrowly than the Middle East, right, is 22 countries, vastly different vastly different countries and vastly different within themselves as well, right? So rural Morocco versus Casablanca is a very different experience. And as a result, being a woman in those two places, and should be no surprise to us, right, as kind of educated intellectual folks, but oftentimes the way we talk about women in the region, we forget. We forget that what does it mean to be a woman in the Arab world is not one thing, right? It's many things. So that's, kind of another starting point for me. So just to give a sense of kind of broad demographic trends. So despite the fact that I'm saying these are dramatically different countries, really different. So thinking about a country like Egypt, which has like a long history of state building and state institutions, and some of the Gulf countries that didn't even exist until the 1960s or 1970s. Like the other day I read a statistic that with the exception of Saudi Arabia, none of the countries in the Arab Gulf, so Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, even had a Ministry of Education before 1970. They just didn't exist. There weren't these kind of institutions. So when I try to understand what's going on educationally in the region, I need to put it in that historical context. Whereas in Egypt, you have this long history of providing formal education, long history of organized women's movements that come with kind of a more established state and more established institutions. Okay, so there's been dramatic growth in population in the region, just as we've seen in a lot of the developing world, as a result of improved health outcomes, improved access to water, resources, dramatic growth. Having said that, there's also been a pretty significant drop in fertility in the past decade, if not the past 2 decades, right? So while we often hear about a very young population and a large population in the region, the reality is fertility rates have decreased significantly in many countries in the region, almost on par with the US and even Europe in some cases, and in some cases actually getting to the point of concern of like not being able to, the concern that a lot of European countries have about being able to kind of replace, reproduce, and continue to grow. So in the last 10 to 20 years, fertility has decreased. You still have a very young population though, so as a result of that, you'll continue to see growth, quite large growth, because the overwhelming number of people in the region are under the age of 25, right? So almost 3/4 in some country are under the age of 25. So the age pyramid in the region is bottom heavy. And so as a result, there's still growth. Alongside, and these are just some broad trends I'm talking about, education, dramatic progress in terms of access. Access to basic education in the region and even secondary education is no longer an issue, with the exception of some very poor countries. Yemen, some parts of rural Morocco, countries like Somalia, Mauritania, which are often counted as part of the region too. Countries that are just much poorer are still struggling with just basic infrastructure, or struggling with conflict. But for the most part, you've seen access for men and women. And the issue now is more sort of an issue of quality and growing kind of inequality in terms of the types of education that young people have. How is this, so these are just some of the broad trends that concern me in my work. How do these trends affect women in the region? So the dramatic demographic shifts have had significant gender impacts, right? So they impact men and women, but differently. Later marriage, women are having fewer children. The average age of marriage in Jordan, for example, in the past 10 years has been between 24 and 26. That's on par with what the average age of marriage is in the US. Now these are averages, so there's still quite a number of women marrying between the age of 20 and 24, for example. But throughout the region, you see an increase in the age of marriage, which is just predictable given more education, fewer children, and also given kind of the economic demands of setting up a household. High rates of education for women. We have a remarkable trend in the region that in fact women are both outnumbering and outperforming men in at least, outnumbering in at least half of the countries in the region. And this is a trend we're seeing in other parts of the world as well. There have been people writing about this in the Caribbean, in the US, people are writing about this too as well. Girls are just doing well in school. So they're in school, for example, in secondary school. Over half of the countries in the region have more girls enrolled in secondary school than boys. At the higher education level, similar patterns. But they're not just in school in larger numbers. We have kind of limited, those of us who are interested in education, limited data to understand how they're doing kind of regionally, but the degree to which a handful of Arab countries participate in these trends in math and science tests that we often hear about here in the US. Singapore is doing better than us in math. Thomas Friedman writes about this, like in the New York Times or so, the crisis of education. So these trends in math and science are these global attempts to compare countries, which have a lot of issues, right? Because making global comparisons are difficult to do. But if we take that as a measure, girls are doing better on math and science in almost every Arab country and Middle Eastern country that participates in those tests. And that's a second set of issues. Like there's the fact that girls are in school at a higher rate in secondary education and doing better even by national standards. And then the math and science question is kind of another question too. One that I'm working on because I'm involved in a research project on women and tech and computing in the region. That's regional. But the high rates of women and the performance of girls in math and science speak to kind of a very different history of how people in the region think about math and science. It's not gendered in the way it has been in our own country, right? In our own country, math and science has always been associated with males. In the Arab world and in other places like India, for example, smart students were supposed to do math and science, regardless of gender. These weren't gendered. If you did well in school, you were tracked into math and science. And because girls are doing well in school, they're being tracked into math and science at higher rates. And as a result, they're doing better on these. As a result, they also study engineering and science at higher rates than women do in the US. In Jordan, almost 50% of the computer engineering majors, for example, are female. There just isn't that baggage, right? That this is a male field versus a female field. So it's a very different kind of historical trajectory. They have other baggage to deal with, but the math science is not it. So that's an interesting one to look at. But even in terms of because I know the Jordan case most intimately, in the Jordanian case, on the national exam, so all students have to take these national exams to get into university. Girls outperform boys by far, in the humanities, in the science, even in some of the vocational tracks. And every year, the Jordanians will who their top 10 scorers are in the country, and 9 out of 10 are female typically. So girls are just doing really well. They're in school and they're doing really well. And the gaps in education in the region and in educational opportunity are really much greater across class and geography. And again, this is not unique to the region. Rural children are the most excluded today in the world in terms of access to education. Now, being female in rural exacerbates your exclusion, right? Because often we don't have female teachers in rural areas. But socioeconomic status and geography are much stronger indicators of your access to education and the quality of education that you get. And that's true in the Arab world as much as it is in other parts of the world as well. And if we look at some of the lowest rates for girls' access to education in the Arab world, we find that boys are just slightly above them, right? That the rural-urban comparison shows the real gaps, the more significant gaps. Now, there's one area in which oftentimes when people talk about development or women's status in the region, they say there still hasn't been significant progress, and that's labor force participation. Given the high rates of education women have in the region, they have relatively low rates of labor force participation. And I'm going to talk about that more specifically in the context of Jordan, because I've been studying this very intimately at different levels. Now, of course, these labor force participation rates vary across the region, but overall they're quite low, again, particularly given their levels of education. Poor women tend to work more, no surprise, that's the same, in our country, middle-class women fought for the right to work, right, in the 50s and 60s, but all along poor women had to work and had to work often in an informal capacity to help their families survive. So you see, for example, in Yemen, when people are actually trying to count agricultural labor or informal labor, that women are actually working at really high rates. So there's sort of an undercounting the informal and the agricultural, but some of the poorest countries actually have the highest rates of women's labor force participation in the region. Single in the case of Jordan, because again I know that one well, single university-educated women are most likely to be working because the kinds of jobs that are available to them are more desirable because they're doing well in fields that are actually growing, whereas a young woman with a high school degree or a high school dropout has few options, as opposed to her male counterpart who has more options because there's sort of more acceptable fields for a high school dropout, but also because men have a lot more pressure to make a living, right? So they can't sort of just decide to opt out. And I'll talk more about that. Just trying to look at some broader trends. Okay. Politically, I'll just say briefly, I mentioned, in some countries in the region, you've had an active women's movement for over a century. Egypt was sending women's groups to like international women's rights conferences in Europe in the early 1900s. I mean, because you had a state, because you had institutions, and because you had reformers writing and thinking about these issues, you had a vibrant women's press in Egypt, as opposed to Jordan, which wasn't even a country before 1950, right? So Jordan didn't have like sort of central institutions. Syria, you had women's organizations, North Africa as well. So there's a long history of kind of women's organizing, and I would say in the contemporary era, a real plethora of women's organizations throughout the region, organizing around a whole range of issues. And the degree to which they are repressed is largely a product of repressive governments and not gender, right? So they're not being repressed because they're women's organizations, they're being repressed because there's very little political freedom in the region. And there's very little space for actual civil society, independent civil society organizations. With some differences, but there's really, with the exception perhaps of Tunisia, who is really trying earnestly to engage in an experiment of democratizing, there are very few spaces in the region where people have freedom to organize, and organize in any way that's viewed as a threat to the regime, including Jordan, which is often seen as this kind of benign monarchy. Relatively speaking, it is better off, but there are lots of red lines that no one can cross, and if you become too powerful even as a women's organization, you're quickly put in your place. So you might not disappear in the night as you might in another country, but there are other ways of kind of silencing people. And I can answer questions about that because that's not the subject of my research, but something I know about intimately. One of the ways in which women's kind of political progress is often measured by like the UN and international organizations is looking at formal political representation. So how many women are in parliament? And you have a range, right? You have a range. Algeria has, 31% of its parliament is female to, almost zero in some other countries. The average for the region is close to 20% representation in national parliaments. The US is about 20% itself, right? And that's a huge increase for us. If we look at our situation over history, there's a great graphic that the Washington Post did. You just see this huge sea of white men, right? And then all of a sudden you see a little whoop, we got some women in there, and so which is just the past couple of decades. But I often argue that formal political representation is somewhat problematic in the region because these are largely undemocratic institutions, right? Hugely undemocratic institutions. So while there is some symbolic value in having women, what does it mean to be a woman in the Saudi, municipal council? So, it does mean some things, but not the things that we maybe think they'll mean, right? For the women who are struggling to have that kind of representation and to participate in some way, I'm sure there is some significance, but if we're thinking about this as meaningful political participation, it's somewhat limited. I will say, okay. One of the other things I guess I want to talk about is if we try to think about sort of challenges, what are the broader challenges facing women in the region? One thing I like to think about, and I guess I've already kind of indicated this, is often the challenges facing women are the same challenges facing men, right? But women experience these differently. So, socio-economic issues, war, conflict, occupation, all these things affect men and women, but women oftentimes have to deal with these in different ways or face different. One of the biggest, I think, challenges in the region has been economic, right? So since the late 70s, early 80s, there have been, in most countries in the region, particularly we have quite wealthy countries, right, who aren't dependent on aid and loans, so countries, the oil-rich countries, right? But the other countries, which are much more dependent on aid or dependent on remittances, they have faced a kind of ongoing socioeconomic crisis, huge international debt, and as a result, there's been lots of, IMF, World Bank policies that are aimed at economic reform in the region, so neoliberal kind of economic policies. And the immediate effect of those policies in countries like Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, Yemen has been quite harsh, right, on your ordinary citizen. There's been a deteriorating of public services. There has been a good deal of corruption along with privatization. That's a lot of what propelled protests in 2011, is the corruption surrounding the privatization policies that were being, promoted by global institutions and kind of pushed on they became conditions of giving loans or forgiving or restructuring loans for these countries. And so as a result, what you see, like some of the specific implications for women, is lack of affordable social services, deteriorating quality of education. And education has been kind of women's ticket in the region. Like, women have understood that education is their way to like make something, do something. And that's why we're seeing higher rates of women in school and doing better. But what we're seeing is, for non-elite women, the deteriorating quality of public education. So that's one of the outcomes of the economic situation and sort of the deterioration of the public sector. Fewer public sector jobs have a huge impact on women, because historically women have preferred public sector jobs in the region because it provides for a better work-family balance. They have better maternity policies in the public sector, more stability, and so women, historically, to the degree that they do work, they're overrepresented in the public sector, and the public sector has been shrinking. So it's shrinking kind of the arena in which women are more likely to enter work. And then the kind of just the overall need for two incomes, particularly for those who are really aspiring to be middle class, has in a lot of ways sort of propelled more women, or particular women, into the workforce. So we might see this as a positive or a negative. For me, the question is always, what are the conditions in which you have to go to work, and are you being forced to work in conditions that are exploitive, right? So that, for me, as someone who has studied labor, while I can take kind of the basic equation, the basic kind of premise that low labor force participation rates are something we need to be concerned about for women, I also want to ask, well, what kind of jobs are available to them, and what are the conditions of those jobs, and is entering the labor force always a sign of something good? Because in some families it's a sign of crisis, right? That a woman has to go out to work and doesn't have someone to care for her child, or sometimes it's a sign of crisis. And it may propel other kinds of changes that are positive in the long run, but it doesn't necessarily indicate progress in the short run. Other more specific challenges, of course, crisis and conflict: Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Palestine, Gaza. Women, these are all conditions that are, again, faced by men, women, and children, but women kind of have to navigate these situations in different ways. And it's impossible to think about the status of a woman in Syria without thinking about this larger conflict and thinking about the violence that's unfolding there, of course. I mean, that's obvious. But in any event, so I just wanted to say that crisis and conflict is a huge part of how we need to understand the experience of women in some contexts there. Though I guess the only thing I'd say is, I'm trying to make these general, talk about these general patterns, but there are some exceptions. Like, I always see Saudi Arabia as kind of an outlier in terms of legislating women's inequality in very specific ways. A lot of the things that we as observers of the region are concerned about when we think about women in the region are not things that women are forced to do, right? They're part of the culture and society, forced in the sense of law, right? So, for example, covering your hair. Saudi Arabia is the only country that requires women to do that, and Iran, too. Or, for example, this non-driving thing, a uniquely Saudi phenomena. It's a dramatically different, women drive in every other country in the region. So there's nothing kind of specific about the region. This is a particularly, so I always, oftentimes the most extreme examples we have of kind of the legal or structural ways in which women are oppressed really come from Saudi Arabia. One exception legally, I'll just mention, is family law in the region. And there's been lots of organizing by women in the region and outside the region around family law. So marriage, divorce, nationality laws, that's where women have kind of very, institutional biases. So for example, a woman in most countries, although as a result of activism this is beginning to change, a woman in most countries can't give her nationality to her child, right? So if a Jordanian woman marries an Egyptian, or marries a Palestinian, or marries a Yemeni, her children have to take the father's citizenship. They can't take her citizenship. So say she gets divorced and she's raising the children. They're not Jordanian citizens and they don't have access to the rights of a Jordanian citizen. Now, as a result of activism in Jordan, they now have kind of a status that is not quite citizen, but access to public services and education. Morocco has changed this law, I believe. So this is one of the kind of the examples of a more institutional bias that women are organizing around, or human rights organizations are organizing around. And then marriage and divorce laws, too, are a huge area of kind of debate, contention, and organizing, too, and trying to give women more rights over, claiming a divorce. And marriage in every country in the region, marriage and divorce are adjudicated by religious courts. So whether you're Muslim or Christian, and I think this is true in Israel as well, that it's through the religious institutions that marriage and divorce are adjudicated. There's no access to civil marriage, there's no access to a civil divorce. And so part of this is about kind of a body of legal history about what a divorce is and who has access to divorce, under what conditions. And so each country has interpreted these slightly differently, but they've actually interpreted them in quite conservative ways, like there's sort of legal history that would have enabled, for example, women to access divorce more easily. And so lots of the organizing around these legal changes is coming out of legal scholars, right? Arguing that Islam actually does allow women to divorce under these conditions, and this should be part of the legal system. Okay. Any questions before I kind of shift to talking about more specific research I've been working on? Yeah.
I have a question about the divorce. So in a country where, does that mean that a Muslim or a Christian woman who's getting divorced has different, in the same country, they'll have different requirements?
So in Jordan, for example, Muslims can get a divorce much more easily than Christians. Because Catholics don't believe in, like in the US, right? Catholics don't believe in divorce. Like you can try to get an annulment and you have to go through church courts to do that. But in the US, if you're a Catholic, you can just get a civil divorce, right? I mean, I had a friend who married a Catholic who was divorced, and her family was very Catholic, and she wanted to get married in church. She could not get married in a church unless he got an annulment from the church, which took years of kind of church judges and lawyers. And so what you see in the Arab world is that's your only option. Church courts and church. So because, with the exception of the Orthodox Church, which I think has a little bit more leeway for divorce, because of the history of Christian institutions, right, it's actually much more difficult for a Christian woman to get a divorce than it is for Muslim women, where there actually are a number of avenues to get a divorce, although men have the upper hand in some of those processes in the Muslim courts. So you get treated differently, and in some cases it's not just Muslim Christian. So in Lebanon you've got the Maronite, you've got the Catholic, you've got the Melkite. So each of these Christian traditions has their own courts and judges to adjudicate things like divorce and marriage. So, yeah.
Does the state pay for the education, or are the families responsible? And the families if the families are responsible, I apologize for my voice. If you repeat the question, if they can't hear it.
Sure.
If the state is not paying, are these families willing? Why are these families so willing to invest in the girls when they do not have this wide range of employment opportunity afterward, or does it just make them more desirable as brides?
So in every country in the region, there's free public education K through 12, but I kind of put that between quotes, right? Because of the deteriorating quality of public education, what you have in some cases is students rely heavily on private tutoring, for example, to pass through. So for example, in Jordan, to get to university, you need to do well on this high school completion exam. And what's been happening, I mean, I've been going back and forth to Jordan doing research on education for almost 20 years now. And I've seen a dramatic shift just in the past 20 years, both in terms of the quality and the reliance on private tutoring. To the point where in 12th grade, half the kids are not even showing up for school anymore. They're going to these private. So there's this kind of informal privatization that's happening. And of course, this creates equity issues because not all kids' families can afford to send them to private tutoring. In the case of Egypt, the problem is even earlier because they need to pass a test. And like after 9th grade, they're tracked into these technical high schools, which are seen as really dead-end high schools, or they're tracked into an academic track. And so even in 7th and 8th and 9th grade, they're relying on private tutoring. So yes, there is free public education, and the public sector is the most dominant, with the exception of Lebanon, which has a long history of privately provided education and sort of a weak state. So actually the private sector is much stronger in Lebanon, although there are public schools. And then the Gulf countries are increasingly relying on private schools, but often heavily subsidizing those schools for their own citizens. Universities are free in some of the countries, but in others they're not.
Yeah, I've spent much of the last year with a woman from Algeria, and I was 2 weeks in Algeria. And there's free education for boys and girls through college and professional school.
Yeah.
And she's in medical school, and she told me that almost all of the people in her medical school class are female.
Yeah, that
and
doesn't surprise me.
And I said, well, what are the professions that the guys are aspiring to? And it's more likely education or setting up a little shop by yourself. As you said, sort of economic pressure. So I was curious about that.
Sure.
What your perception is of that, whether mine is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good segue to education, which is what I know more intimately. I mean, when I did ethnographic research in Jordan, so I spent a year at a girls' high school, and then and in a lot of countries in the region, education is, girls and boys are separated after 5th grade, so it's sort of easy to compare boys and girls schools because boys are in different schools than girls in the majority of the country, in public schools. And I interviewed maybe 30 families, and I have 14 families that I did kind of case studies on. Every time I asked parents, what do you think about your daughter's education, or how do you feel about the girls' school? They'd say, my daughter's fine, her school is fine. Let me tell you about my son. And then they would start complaining about the conditions of boys' schools, or the boy's refusal to study. I can't get him to sit down, or he refuses to retake the high school exam because he failed it, and he says, I'm done, I'm over with. And so that was kind of my first inclination into this narrative of boys being these problematic students that the parents were telling me about. But since then I've kind of studied it more broadly, and there are a number of issues, and they vary from country to country. So in a country like the United Arab Emirates, which is quite wealthy, that's where we see the biggest gap between boys and girls, to girls' advantage in terms of high school completion. By almost 20% girls are finishing high school, higher than boys. In the case of the UAE, one of the issues is there's no motivation for the boys. They're guaranteed a lucrative job in the public sector as citizens of the UAE. That's the situation in the UAE. But also in the UAE, one of the students I worked with on her dissertation, she compared boys and girls schools. She spent time in both of those. And the school environment is really different. So for example, in the UAE, they can't get male citizens to become teachers. So most of their teachers are imported from other Arab countries, and there's high turnover of teachers. And it really impacts the school environment and the quality of teaching. Whereas in the female schools, they've done a better job of recruiting Emirati female teachers, and that just changes the whole dynamic of the school. In a place like Jordan, I once saw dropout rates, high school dropout rates, and what you see is in kind of high tourism areas, for example. So Petra is a famous tourist site in Jordan. I saw some statistics, and I haven't been able to find more recent ones. There are high dropout rates for boys in the Petra area. Well, for boys in the Petra area, relatively poor part of the country, there are relatively lucrative jobs, right, in tourism. You know, taking camels into Petra, giving people rides, selling trinkets. And while some women do those things, it's much harder for a young girl to participate in those activities for a range of cultural reasons. And the boys, either of their own, and oftentimes when boys are dropping out, the statistics we see is they don't say, my parents pushed me out to make a living. They say, I hated school and I wanted to do something else and I left. I mean, if you ask kids, that's what they will often say. So there are of course situations where children are pressured to help their family, but in many situations, they're young and they're thinking school is awful, there's 70 kids in my class. Again, if we're talking about poor quality education and lower income students, and I can go out and make a living, or I could help my parents, or I could buy my own cigarettes, or I could do whatever the rationale of the, so you see higher dropout rates there. And I saw a really interesting study in Cairo that was based on this adolescent survey that was done in Cairo. And again, you see higher rates of dropout at the 8th, 9th grade level for boys than girls of these lower economic groups. And school factors have a huge factor to play, right? School-based factors. What else was I going to say? So there are a number of different reasons. I mean, yeah, is this a question about the same? Yeah.
Well, I just want to make a comment. I spent some time together, and the impression in the university city part, and of course they're one of these countries, they're like just unbelievably wealthy, and so every male citizen is they all are in these jobs that are nothing jobs, but
Yeah.
they pay well, and then they have all the foreigners doing the actual work. But the point was that for women, I was told, and also we visited a lot of labs where there were a lot of women working. For women to get a degree and have a profession, that's liberation, because otherwise they're going to be at home doing whatever. But if they have a degree or a credential, then they can actually get out and have an interesting life doing something that interests them rather than staying home with their female relatives. So I thought that was probably a big part of the motivation, because it was obvious that the women had, a lot of them had very good advanced degrees and stuff, and were real motivated to be doing whatever work they were doing, because it was like escape.
I mean, it's true to a degree, but I think we have to look at women over their life cycles, right? Because the reality is lots of women drop out of the workforce once they get married. And they're not always being forced to do that, right? They're making the choice to do that when they can, in the absence, sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So, and this goes to the question that someone asked earlier of why would families be investing in education if women are not working? And this is really interesting. I mean, my first book was called Gender Paradoxes. And I didn't think there were paradoxes, but I was kind of taking this term that the World Bank had written this report about Jordan around the time I was doing research there. And they referred to Jordan as this paradox because of high rates of education, one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the region. And so I was kind of, this is one of the things I was talking with young women about and their families. Well, what are you doing education for? What is education for? And clearly education is about status, right? And that's been true all over the world. And sometimes that status is about marrying well, right? And particularly for lower income families who are aspiring to be middle class. I mean, I think about this woman, Ayman, who was basically a single mom. I mean, she was still technically married, but her spouse, they were quite, poor. Her spouse was working in the Gulf, but not really sending any money home. It was kind of a loser, to use a shorthand, right? I mean, just not taking responsibility for his family and showing up at intervals, blah, blah, blah. And she was, working as a janitor at the local Ministry of Education, baking bread at home and selling it to people for special occasions, because while you had bakeries, she was making kind of this old-fashioned bread that wasn't easily available anymore, but people want for special occasions. Taking care of children at home. She had a daughter who had a slight kind of mental disability and she didn't end up finishing high school, but was really great with kids. And so between her and her daughter, they were taking in neighbors' kids. And so she was doing all this work. And when you talked to her about what she wanted for her daughter, she really wanted her to go to university, but it wasn't necessarily to work. Although it wasn't that she was saying, I don't want my daughter to work, but her aspiration was, I hope she marries somebody, better than her father, somebody who can take care of her, somebody who did. So of course, kind of how people think about this. Now, you talk to young women though, right? When I talk to the high school women, they say, if I don't get into university, my life is over. And this is particularly true if they don't live in an urban center, right? The city that I did research in, so in this high school that I worked in, was a city of about 60,000 people. Relatively conservative, relatively poor. It's now almost doubled in size because it's near the Syrian border. And there've been, 1 million Syrians are in Jordan right now. This is just in the last few years. I mean, the dramatic kind of changes that have happened. The capital city, Amman, has doubled in population in the last 10 years as a result of Iraqis, Syrians, Libyans. Anyway, a step back. So in the city I was working in, I was really interested in schools because schools were really the only space that adolescent girls had access to. And that's not to say that we had great clubs and things for boys, but boys just hung out on the street, which wasn't an option for girls. So in a poor town where there's very little kind of leisure opportunity for young women, leisure is time with your family, time with your neighbors maybe. And so for the young girls who were at high school, university was like, wow, I get to leave the town. Although they were really upset about the fact that they had built a university near their city because they used to be able to go to this other city that was a half an hour away. And to a 15, 16-year-old girl, that was like, wow, I get to go to, it's the second largest city in Jordan. And there's a cafe culture and there's this and that. So they built a university in the desert 15 minutes outside of this town. And it took away that opportunity from some of them. But yeah, for a lot of the adolescents who I talked to, there was this view of, I gotta get to university. It wasn't even as far as work, I need to get out of here. But then, I mean, there were others too. I remember this young woman who, again, had a really difficult family life, really kind of broken family, and she felt very embarrassed about that, embarrassed about the situation of her family, because she felt like there was all this gossip about them. And she kept saying, I have to become a doctor. I have to become a doctor. And for her, doctor was what represented kind of the way to get status, right? The way I could overcome, not just financial, but this reputation of my family as like a bad family or a broken family. And she was just singularly obsessed with this idea of this is the only way I can succeed. Now, I mean, all of the families I talked to, with very few exceptions, I can barely think of an exception in Jordan, were desperate for their children to be educated, male and female. And particularly for the females, because they understood that there weren't that many alternatives to them, right? Like, even if they didn't end up working, they felt like getting education was important. It was important for their status, was important for their role as mothers, etc. So if you look at a country like Jordan, something like 60% of single university educated women work. So when we look at these statistics, Jordan's overall labor force participation rate for women is like 15%. Now, of course, they count, for some reason, when we count labor force participation rates in other countries, we look at everyone between the ages of 15 and 55. Now, the females between the ages of 15 and 19 in Jordan, 90% of them are in school. So there's a way in which that also is problematic. But if you look at life course, what you see again is when women are single and university educated, so they really have good opportunities, they are very likely to be working. And you look at, and there are very high rates of unemployment for women, so women actively seeking employment. If you incorporate the high rates of unemployment in a country like Jordan amongst university students, 3/4 of the women are either working or actively seeking work. When they get married, a lot of them drop out of the workforce. They are less likely to drop out of the workforce if they work in the public sector. Public sector gives guaranteed maternity for a year, and actually Jordan gets criticized for giving that. Like in these kind of economic reports that say Jordan needs to reform to make its country more desirable for investment, to create more jobs, a year's maternity leave is actually criticized as a disincentive for private firms to hire women, for example. And also the public, and this is changing, but the public sector historically had better hours, you worked from 9 to 3, you go home, you have a big family meal. This is changing, but this is the history of public sector. It's very kind of fits well with family life, right? Whereas the private sector, you get home at 6 and who's taking care of the kids, and the kids are out of school by 1, and there's very little decent childcare. And for wealthier families, they're actually increasingly depending on the labor of like exploited women from places like the Philippines or Bangladesh to take care of their children. So there's a way in which women's work is kind of a global issue here, right? To enable women in Jordan to work, you have to hire somebody from Sri Lanka to take care of your child because there's so little childcare available. Yeah.
So earlier on in your talk,
Yeah.
you mentioned Jordan. You said, well, we all think of Jordan, as a progressive monarchy, but there are subtle pressures on women. I'm trying to remember what you said, but I made a mental note, got to ask more about that. Subtle pressures on
Not on women necessarily, but on everyone.
I'd just like to hear
Yeah,
more
sure.
about that, because I have this idea of Jordan as being progressive.
Yeah, I mean, it's all relative, right? You compare Jordan like the king to Saddam Hussein, but it's a monarchy in the full sense of the word. It's an absolute monarchy, right? Nobody makes any real decisions in the country except the monarch and those around the monarchy. So politically speaking, it's not a free country. It's not as openly repressive, right? And there's another thing, right? There are a few things, but so political freedoms are really almost absent. Yeah, there's a parliament. The parliament has very little power. The parliament is like a rubber stamp kind of parliament. There are all kinds of so from the establishment of Jordan until the 1980s, there wasn't a parliament and political parties were banned, right? So in the 80s, as a result of increasing prices and this kind of economic crisis, people started protesting. And they were protesting in parts of the countries that were considered the loyal parts of the countries. As a result of that, there was this brief political opening. There were elections. The monarchy didn't like who was elected to that process, who were largely, the Muslim Brotherhood won the majority of seats in the parliament. And that was because the Muslim Brotherhood, while all the other parties were repressed and unable to organize, the Muslim Brotherhood had schools and charity organizations, so they had a base. So they were in a better position to organize themselves once there was a little bit of a political opening. So I mean, all this is to say, yes, there are differences in the countries in the region, right? But there's very limited political freedom. There's limited press freedom. There are little bits here and there, but there's lots of self-censorship. And there is also kind of a complacency, which it was really funny for me to watch. I was in Jordan in 2011 during the Arab Spring for 7 months. And then I went back 4 or 5 times over a span of 2 years. So it was this like an intense period in which I saw so much kind of happening politically. And there was, for the first time, kind of a real, or for the first time in a long time, a real genuine demand for reform in Jordan. So even though there weren't these mass-based protests, there were regular protests. People were talking about constitutional monarchy. People were kind of pushing for changes in election laws. And so there was a push, and there was a brief while in which the government allowed that to happen. So you can't organize protests without a permit. And if they don't like the protest you're having, you can't have that permit. Protesters were being, violently repressed, sometimes by thugs that were being paid by the government to go out and kind of, create troubles in the protests. But having said that, so there was this period in which they sort of allowed protests and then quickly shut it down. At the same time, if I can just kind of talk about a pulse of what I'm feeling amongst different groups of people in Jordan, as things unfolded in Syria and as things unfolded in Egypt and the situation became quite terrible in those 2 countries, there's a way in which kind of the we're better off than everyone else sort of sentiment holds the place together and kind of pulls back from this, we need more, political freedom. And in a lot, those of us who study Jordan talk about this all the time because it's something hard to put your finger on or to measure, right? But there's a way in which that has because people always wonder how the regime has survived in Jordan, particularly given, doubling of the population, skyrocketing prices. The cost of living in Amman is almost on par with DC, with the exception of rents. It's really so expensive. I don't know how people survive. The starting salary for a public school teacher is about $350 a month. It's amazing to me that people continue to survive. Part of the reason why they continue to survive is they still have these social family kin networks and kind of private safety nets. But politically speaking, yes, people do feel like they're better off, and I think that goes a long way. But it's quite constrained. And so as a women's organization, it's not that you're going to be repressed as a women's organization per se, but a lot of the most powerful organizations, we have NGOs, non-governmental organizations. In Jordan, they call them ringos, royal NGOs. Like that's the kind of the literature talks about, because they're not really non-governmental. They have kind of a loyal head. And then even our own USAID funds these groups, and they are our primary partners. And there's just a way in which we work with that reality there too. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'll give you just one last example. You can get arrested in Jordan for a Facebook post. You won't get assassinated, you won't get this, but it'll be like, don't say that again. You might get held for a few months, and then you'll be let out. So in the past year, I can think of 5 people who've been arrested for something they put on Facebook.
Yeah, I asked that question.
Yeah.
Maybe people are reading between the lines, is why I might have asked that question. Is, how can a country that's supposed to be democratic become repressive? How can that happen? So I'm asking that.
I don't think any of the U.S. officials think of Jordan as democratic. I think they think of enlightened monarch is the way they see it. Because anyone who works with the country, they know it's quite obvious, right, that it's not democratic. And I have a number of students who worked, right now I have 2 foreign service officers studying at Georgetown, both of whom so they're not foreign service officers, they're called FAOs, foreign affairs officers. So they're military guys who decide to go kind of the track of foreign affairs. And 2 of them have both just done extensive stints in Jordan. And anyone who works kind of for a while on the ground there's no illusions about democracy. And then it's just a question of, do you come on the side of, well, you need authoritarianism here to keep this stable. Jordan is a strong ally of the US. And I also think the royal family has been very good about their image, particularly their image to external, right? The king has been on Jon Stewart twice. The queen was on Oprah, 4 years ago. They're very good about how they present themselves. And it's funny because people always ask me, well, do you think he really cares about women's rights? And he just can't do it because his citizens are too conservative. And I just don't buy that, because when he wants to do something, he does it. He signed a peace treaty with Israel, and nobody supported that in the country, but he did it. So if he wanted to change the divorce laws, he could. And that's kind of, there's sort of what becomes a priority and what people are willing to support. And so women's issues are often they're used as this kind of tool or symbol. And so I think it's kind of the question of whether the monarchy really supports more progressive policies on women is sort of irrelevant when you're in control of a country and you're calling the shots, right? Yeah.
It's been refreshing to hear about the quality of education and participation. And I'm wondering, with the regressive governments, what the areas of conflict are in getting an excellent education and putting up with the government in terms of, I mean, not just Facebook, but studying about governments or about literature or...
You hit on a very important point. The humanities have been underfunded and undervalued, and I think for very political reasons. So, in part political reasons. So, historically in the developing world, right, after this kind of post-World War II, there's a big push for math and science and engineers because of the idea of what we needed for economic development in the region. And as a result, humanities became, students, the weak students are pushed into the humanities, but there are also deeply political reasons, right? It's very hard to do serious social science research in the region. Where it's happening is usually in kind of more independent research think tanks. Now again, in a regime like the Syrian regime, that's not happening anywhere. But in Jordan, there are spaces for that, right? And they work to kind of navigate. I mean, there are spaces in which critique is written. So for example, there's a very active labor organization in Jordan, and I wrote a little bit about the independent labor movement in Jordan because I was there in 2011, where actually most of the protests were labor protests during the Arab Spring in Jordan. And so there are people criticizing the government for not allowing people to organize. I mean, so there is a space in which there are these independent institutions. At universities, it's very difficult because the university jobs are often patronage jobs. I think in North Africa, there's a little bit more independence in some universities. And then you've got places like American University of Cairo, American University of Beirut, so private universities with a long history of relative independence from the government. I mean, they still are somewhat constrained. But, so yes, the humanities and social sciences are under-supported, under-influenced, and devalued as a result of that. And there's a way in which, if you think about the example of Jordan, but it's similar to other countries. When I was doing work in high schools there, the bottom third of students, so based on their score on a test, the bottom third were sent to vocational schools, the middle third were sent on the humanities literary track, and the top third were sent to math and science. Now, those in the math and science could say, no, I really want to do language, and they could ask for that if they could convince their families, but it was very hard to do the opposite. And so the kids who perform well in school, who know how to do school and know how to do it well, are the ones who are going into math and science. And some of, like Arabic, for example, some of the lowest performing students are being pushed into Arabic, so there's a real issue about Arabic language instruction in the region. Yeah. So, and people always ask me about like teaching critical thinking and these sorts of things. And again, if we take Jordan as an example, right, forward-looking, they have all these educational reform efforts. When I was there in 2005, I sat in on teacher professional development, and they were talking about problem-based learning, critical thinking, small groups. But the reality is they're not really interested in serious. They're interested in it to a degree, right? Math is like safe critical thinking for them, right? Let's do critical thinking in the math context. But they don't want, so I'll give an example. At the university, there was this kind of service learning initiative that USAID was funding, and students who participated in this club were told to think about an issue in their society they were concerned with, and how would they address it. But there were some issues that just could not be on the table, and there were some issues that were. So there's this weird kind of, on the one hand, we're trying to promote kind of critical reflection on society, but there's a red line, and you can't go past it. And of course, this varies. I mean, in the Gulf countries are much more repressive in terms of this kind of, particularly like Saudi Arabia. I mean, the UAE, like despite kind of Dubai, global city, there's real, I mean, there's an academic in the UAE who was just arrested just for a short while and then let out. Political scientist who was somewhat critical. He had been a visiting professor at Georgetown actually for a year. So every once in a while you're reminded not to take it too far. Yeah.
We were told once by a Palestinian tour guide in Israel that when he was growing up, he did not learn about the Holocaust. They were not taught about that. And I'm curious about other Arab school systems, if you know about that kind of content.
don't. I mean, it wasn't in the Jordanian curriculum when I was like kind of paying attention to the curriculum, but there's very little actually history, social studies being taught at all. I mean, like just to give you a sense, even their own history, right? The contemporary, so there's, in the history books that I was looking at closely, and I don't work with textbooks that much. Actually, part of the reason why I decided to go into schools was because everything that was being written about education in the Arab world was based on people reading textbooks. No one was in schools, no one was talking to teachers, and so I was really interested in what was going on in the classroom. But having said that, when I was in schools, I was paying attention to the lessons the students were learning. History was essentially kind of this early Islamic history, and then the Hashemites, which is the monarchy. The Hashemites and the Arab Revolution as the lead, the Hashemites as the leader of this revolution against the Ottomans, and then all the great things the Hashemites have brought to Jordan. I mean, that was history. And now I know they've added European history, and I don't know if I'm not sure. And I'm talking about Jordan. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if anyone's teaching about the Holocaust in the region, perhaps in North Africa. I think I might have heard something that there was something, perhaps in Morocco. But they're not even learning about Europe, it's very limited history that they're learning, although there were some attempts to change that. And I saw some kind of pilot books in the Jordanian case, but I don't know how far it went. The one exception, there were two exceptions, not on the Holocaust, but on kind of teaching other things, was the English curriculum and civic education. So civic education would talk about like Geneva Conventions and the human rights conventions, and in English they would talk. Sometimes you would have lessons about the U.S. sort of, or England or other political systems. But I can't speak to beyond that. Yeah, Jane? Yeah.
Since the boys and girls are so separated, what do they think of each other? What kind of interactions are there in high school?
You get me to my favorite topic. I just published an article on love in Jordan, love and marriage and single people in Jordan. And so when I went to do, I said at the beginning of my talk that I had all these assumptions about a place like Jordan and what would it be like. And my parents were very conservative. They both came from little villages. And I was the oldest of their children, right? So they've changed a lot. I'm the oldest of 7. They've changed a lot. So I was told, you can't talk to boys, you must marry Jordanian, dating is forbidden. Like it was all like everything. I went to an all-girls high school in New York, and so I just had this image that I would go to this high school in Jordan and this would be forbidden, taboo, and no one would be talking, and I shouldn't ask them about these things, and I kind of went in with this. And of course, like the majority of the girls wanted to do nothing but talk about boys. And talk about like movie stars, or talk about, there was this Arab Idol kind of, it's not Arab, now it's Arab Idol, Star Academy, which was like a kind of reality show for young performers throughout the region. And my absolute favorite kind of moment, and it's a vivid one, this is in 2005, right, I'm thinking about, and I write about it in my book, it's kind of like the spring fever moment. I'm in the schoolyard talking to kids, and these 3 or 4 girls come up. They're kind of hanging off of each other like this, and they say, Miss Fida, do they love in America? And I said, yes. Do they love in Jordan? And she's like, that's all we do. And it was just like one of these moments where I thought, yes, probably a bit too cheesy for our own kids, our own Montgomery County kids. But there was this moment when I felt like, wow, this is like any other girls' school and any other place in some ways, right? And they, who had the pictures of, what movie star, and it was often somebody, they were really into the Titanic when I was there, even though that was kind of old here, right? But Oprah too. Everybody was always talking about Oprah, and Friends. Some of them were watching Friends, and so in any event, so there is a great deal, particularly if they're not living in kind of more urban, cosmopolitan places, right? There's a great deal of segregation in their lives until they go to university, right? Except for males in their own family. There isn't necessarily opportunity. They'd be going to school with girls since 5th grade at least, if not sooner. And there isn't necessarily kind of extracurricular activities that will engage them, with some exceptions. Now, of course, if they live in the capital, if they're more elite, and there are great differences socially in the region too, not just economically. Like, in Jordan, I will see groups of high school boys and girls hanging out at the mall and at restaurants. They're a particular class of kids, right? And they live a particular way. But this was shocking to me as the daughter of like farmers from small villages in Jordan. I just didn't think this happened, right? I just thought, wow, how could this happen? And particularly in the community I was in, which was relatively conservative. So having said that, I don't know so much because of the kind of cohort that I've studied, are high school students, university students, and now young professionals, because I've been studying, I'm writing a book right now on young women who migrate from the provinces to the capital for work. But I did this marriage kind of project in 2011, and it got kind of derailed by the Arab Spring, but I interviewed 50 single men and women, university educated, living and working in Amman, about kind of marriage and how they're feeling about marriage, and particularly because there's this discourse of like there's a marriage crisis. People can't get married because of the economic situation. And you hear this a lot throughout the region. Part of it is people are getting married later, and there's lots of anxiety amongst an older generation about people not getting married and what that means. So they're unmarried for a much longer time, and if they're going to university and they're working, they're actually interacting with the opposite sex a lot more than they might have, right? In an earlier generation when they probably would have married at 17 or 18, right? And started raising a family at that age. So sort of unmarried for a longer time. And there's lots of, I call it the arranged dating continuum. Like when I talk to people about how they're meeting each other, and they all kind of talk about university as this time where they just not serious relationships, but after university they see every relationship as, is this a potential marriage partner or not? So in the Jordanian case, there are lots of interesting kind of new spaces where this can happen. I mean, I lived in Amman in the early 90s, and there were very few cafes. So there were like lots of older men cafes in the downtown area, and then there were like really ritzy coffee shops and like the Intercontinental Hotel, but very few other spaces that both young men and women could kind of hang out in ways that would not be viewed as problematic. Now they're just everywhere. Starbucks, Gloria Jeans, McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts. I mean, there are all these places, particularly around universities, where you often will see young men and women chatting. So it's not quite dating on the scale that we have it here, although for some of the more elite classes, maybe. But there's lots of kind of trying to get to know each other and navigate, even for young men and women from more conservative families, where the families are really trying to arrange marriages. There's lots of kind of behind the scenes trying to get to know people before they come to your house. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the universities, for those who make it to university, which is almost half, the tertiary, post-secondary enrollment rates are about 45% in Jordan. So almost half of kids are at some kind of post-secondary, whether it's community college or university. So there's lots of space, and they're all co-educational, with the exception of a few community colleges. Yeah.
What about the literature? You said the sort of middle range students get into the humanities. Are there, I don't know any Jordanian poets or fiction writers, but who are the ones, and how good are they? And what are they writing about? Or don't they exist?
I mean, Jordan has a much shorter, like a much more narrow history and field of folks doing literature. I mean, but people are really reading across borders, right? So Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Palestinian, and then of course Jordan has, over half of its population is of Palestinian descent as well, or about half of it, who knows how many exactly, no one is willing to count. Anyway, so there's a really vibrant kind of Arabic language, literature, poetry. So there's some folks on the Jordanian scene. I'm a really bad anthropologist because I don't keep up on this stuff. I mean, I know there are a handful of folks who are quite well known in Jordan, and one has been getting translated into English. His name is Amjad Nasser, and he does both poetry, and he's recently written a somewhat biographical story. He actually won some prestigious literary award, but the U.S. wouldn't let him into the country a couple of years ago. Hisham Bustani, also the U.S. wouldn't let him into the country either last year. He's been writing poetry and fiction as well. There's a woman, I mean, if anyone's interested in these references, I could send them along because I'm really bad with names, but there's a woman who's written a great novel that's kind of set in a mental institution in Jordan, and it's historical, but also it kind of looks at the British Mandate period and British oppression of this tribal revolt, but it's all through this conversation between these two women in a mental institution in Jordan. So there's work out there. Jordan is just kind of newer on the scene, right? I mean, Egypt has like centuries old, vibrant literature, film. Jordan's been trying to break onto the film scene recently. One of the films that kind of made its circulation here last year was Veeb. It was like an Oscar nomination for foreign film. There's the Royal Film Society has really been pushing film in Jordan. And there are a number of Palestinian filmmakers who are making films in Jordan because they can't get into Israel. So a friend of mine from graduate school, Amory Jasser, she made a film about making a film in the West Bank. And then she made a film called Salt of this Sea. And then she was banned after that from going back into Israel. So she made her third film in Jordan about a young boy who's a Palestinian refugee who like runs away from his mom and tries to walk back to his village through the Jordan Valley. Yeah, so there are a number of people in that situation who are making films in Jordan as well. North Africa has a vibrant film, literature. I mean, there's so much diversity in the region. Even the Gulf, I mean, we had a whole course on Gulf literature last year, and we had a visiting scholar, a woman who's an Arabic literature professor from, I believe she was from Bahrain, and she taught a class for us on Gulf literature. We have a Syrian scholar with us right now who came to us through the Scholar Rescue Fund. He's just phenomenal, just a phenomenal professor. And he's teaching a prison literature course this semester, entirely in Arabic, because we're lucky enough at Georgetown to have students who have really high levels of Arabic. He taught a course on Syrian literature, prison literature, and the Syrian Revolution in Arabic. And he's just been this phenomenal professor. I mean, he came here from a refugee camp after escaping from Raqqa, which is under ISIS control still. He crossed the border with his wife and like 2 toddlers, and then came to the US, and within 2 weeks was in the classroom teaching our students. And it was a rough start, but he's just a phenomenal professor. Students absolutely love him. But Syrian, there's a really rich Syrian literature too. And you know, these borders are so new too. Like Amjad Nasser, who I just mentioned, the Jordanian poet, his family's from a Bedouin tribe, half of which ended up on the Syrian side after World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when the French and the British just kind of drew some borders on the map. His family, and half of them ended up in Jordan, half of them ended up in Syria. We get to claim him as our Jordanian literary, luminary, because he ended up on the Jordanian side of the border. But oftentimes, but the literary circles, I think, are much more fluid. Yes?
I hope if you have some more you wanted to tell us, I hope you can get back in charge of it. But I'm just curious about your family, how and why they managed to come to this.
It was pretty easy to immigrate in those years. From the 60s, and my father came, like many immigrants in this country, just for a few years to make some money and go back. And he never went back. He was really, he applied. He was pressured by his family for economic reasons. He was the only one in his family who had gotten much education. He left school in 6th grade, but then went back and managed to do like a high school degree doing a correspondence degree. And he was a literacy teacher in Jordan. He was a school teacher for a while, and then he got this opportunity to come to the U.S. and thought he'd be able to go to school here, but never was able to. So it's like a classic kind of immigrant. He worked 3 jobs. He worked everything from washing dishes to a security guard. Eventually became a union shop steward at a factory where he worked for 35 years. Factory closed down, so he retired after it closed down. And he lived here for 4 years. He went back and married my mom, arranged marriage. They still live in Yonkers. We're all trying, yes.
What were the Jordanian writers espousing that they couldn't get into the U.S.?
Amjad Nasser, I suspect, has nothing to do with his writing, because it's not very political writing, but Amjad Nasser belonged to this leftist political party when he was about 18. And he was, this would have been the 70s, early 70s, and he was exiled from Jordan for 7 years. He lived in Syria for 7 years. So my guess is that's what's banning him. It's not what he's writing, it's this history. I mean, he's now in his probably close to 60. So, Husham Bustani, I'm not sure. Husham Bustani is a leftist, and kind of in a shrinking field of communists and socialists in the Arab world. Husham Bustani is quite avowedly, I think he's in the Communist Party, and I wonder if that's, we're still concerned about communists and leftists, I guess, and not just Islamists. So I guess that's probably why Hisham, but we're also just randomly not letting people in from the region there's a lot, this ban is not, the ban in the sense of formalizing these processes is new, but we have lots of colleagues who have a difficult time traveling here and traveling into Israel. More so to Israel than here, but we're trying to compete with Israel now with this ban. Yeah.
What kind of effect does or how are the women's movements in the West perceived in the Middle East?
Yeah, great question. It's a complicated answer, right? Because there's a long history of the West rationalizing intervention in the region for women's rights, right? Whether it's the Cromer of the the British colonial officer who was against suffrage for women in England, but rationalized colonizing Egypt because of the way they treated their women, amongst other things, to Afghanistan, right? We're going to save Afghani women. That's part of the reason we're going into Afghanistan. So while I think many local feminists do take inspiration from the work, and there's lots of collaboration, right, across borders and globally at these kind of international forums, they're quite, kind of the Western feminism is quite politicized, right, because of this history. And so because these issues are so politicized, they can become very polemical, right, very black and white. This is a Western infiltration, this is against our culture. And so at a level of kind of fierce political debate, sometimes that's what it comes down to. You're trying to impose something that's foreign to our, but at the level of kind of the work that's happening, the real work that's happening at the level of kind of organizing, NGOs, local women's organizations, I think there is lots of collaboration, but there's a lot of like women in the region are quite cognizant of that history, right? And so are very careful about talking about how this is not foreign to our culture, right? How this is not, depending on who the women are, there's some very secular women's organizations, there's some women's organizations that take kind of an Islamic orientation, and so they try to argue that women's equality is protected in Islam, so it's about kind of arguing on the grounds of our own religious tradition or grounds of other traditions. So I think it's a mixed bag, but it can be quite politicized, right? Particularly if there's a sense that someone from the outside is trying to change something. And so I think women have become quite savvy about how to navigate that stuff. Yeah. Someone asked me about if I had talked about everything I wanted to talk about, and in many ways I have. I've kind of hit on the issues. I didn't talk about kind of the specifics of my own research, except maybe the school. I'll just end up saying that the other kind of fascinating project I'm doing now. So I started with schools, and one of the main things I kind of concluded about the book, in that book about the school and schools, was, education is not just for work, right? There are lots of other reasons why young women and their families are pursuing education. And we need to kind of accept that those choices can be valid, right? All of our choices are limited in some way, but a lot of the debates I would hear women, particularly young professionals, a lot of the kind of decision-making that they were having about whether to work or not sounds very much like what we have, right? Every once in a while we have an op-ed about leaning in, leaning out, taking care of our children, my right to stay home and take care of my child, or the person who argues that that's a waste of our education. I mean, there was an op-ed in the New York Times around the time I was writing my book about how women who got these, MBAs or degrees and stayed home with their children were wasting their education. And so this is a debate we're having here. Many women there are having that debate as well. Like, how do I be a good mother and take care of my family, but also pursue these other professional, or maybe I don't care about the professional, or maybe I do. There are a whole range of things. But what's interesting is I conclude that book by kind of arguing that schools are important places for young women, and education is important irrespective of these kind of economic outcomes. But my new book is actually looking at women who say, I didn't want to waste my education. When I ask them, how could you leave your village and come to the capital and work? They say, well, I didn't want to waste my education. I'm an engineer. I can't just sit at home. And this is a kind of pretty amazing phenomena in Jordan too, because it's sort of very unheard of for a young woman to live, a single young woman to live on her own in Jordan. But this is changing. Historically, the only women who migrated for work were rich elite women, or educated elite women who went to the rural areas to teach. So as school teachers, and you saw that in many countries, right? Elite urban women going to the villages to teach. But now what I'm studying is rural women going to the capital to work, because there's basically no work. As the public sector has shrunk, there's no real, there are no decent career opportunities for women, particularly in women in STEM fields. And in my research, 75% of the women I interviewed were in some kind of STEM-related field, and they're going to the capital for work, and they're living often in dormitories. So sort of what we saw women from the Midwest going to, like, living in YWCAs or living in hostels for women in New York City. It's a similar kind of phenomenon. They're living in student dormitories in the capital, and they're working, and sometimes 10, 15 years living on their own and working in the capital. And that's the book I'm writing now, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it now or afterwards, but I know it's 12 o'clock. We've got them, so. Any other, do we have time for another question, or should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I went to the Women's College at the University of North Carolina,
Uh-huh.
and the way we got that was Charles Duncan McKeever told the state senators, when you educate a woman, you educate a family.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah. And that's a very strong discourse too. Like, even if I don't work, to raise my children well, I need to be educated, or to help them with school, I need to be educated. So there's a strong sense that that's also an important role. And a lot of valuing of that role of motherhood. Yeah.
Also, back for those of us who went through school in the 50s and 60s, a lot of women went to college not for their bachelor's degree, but for their MRS.
Yes.
Again, you have the opportunity to meet men of the same intellectual level and raise children. That was just about when it was changing.
Yeah, and so in a lot of ways I see parallels, right? So it's not exactly the same situation. There are things that are different, but I see a lot of parallels, even like in terms of the division of labor, right? For 60 years or 50 years now, we've been measuring kind of time usage of men and women. So couples where the man and the woman both work, how many hours is each of them doing childcare, cooking, cleaning, shopping? Well, it's taken us 60 years to get some parity. And even then, in the U.S., right, in these surveys that we do, even then in the U.S., childcare is still primarily a woman's responsibility, even if she's working full time. And that's the challenge women are facing in the Arab world, because a lot of these domestic responsibilities are still seen primarily as there. So there's this double burden, right, when you have a full-time job.
Is there a change as far as the men are concerned?
I see examples of change. It's hard to see, like, to quantify it. No one's actually counting this in the way that we've been doing for the last 50 years. But you see some examples of it. I mean, in my interactions with families over the last 20 years, yeah, you do. I mean, it just by force, and sometimes it's just by force, right? In the end, you're just by the forces of, the world around you, it just starts to happen. And what's interesting is, change happens before we're willing to talk about it often, right? So the stories we tell about our own society, our own marriages, our own family, is one thing, but then in practice, oftentimes there's something different happening. And I like to think about that. I mean, there's still this very strong ideology of male breadwinner, and the man is primarily responsible. But in many families, the woman is just as important, if not more important, than the male in terms of supporting the family economically. But that narrative is not going to change for a long time. It's still seen as primarily he's failing if she's the one who's bringing in most of the bacon, right? And that doesn't sound unfamiliar to us, does it? Yeah.
Am I right in expecting that the situation in the United States where cohabitation is endemic?
Absolutely unheard of, yes, in the region. Yeah, this doesn't happen. Yeah.
I'm just curious about LGBTQ. Is it all underground, or are there safe places that people can go?
There are some safe LGBT communities, and are they all underground? That's a complicated. So in some places like Lebanon, they are openly organizing, and they have NGOs that are specifically working on LGBTQ rights. It's a very difficult situation for these communities, which of course have always existed, but now are kind of facing the same thing that women face, that this is a Western thing, right? So while there have always been these communities, and perhaps even some safe spaces, now that there's kind of a spotlight on these communities that's coming from outside, and there has been, so for example, the US ambassador in Jordan gave a talk where I don't remember the exact thing she said, but she took like a very strong position on this, on the LGBT community and their rights in Jordan, and some of the members of that community really told her that was not helpful, right? Like, we're trying to organize on our own, But once you, the US ambassador, make this a public issue, because there was a huge outcry by conservatives, right? Huge outcry. That they're imposing this foreign way of life upon us. So it's a difficult issue, and it's actually probably gotten worse for people in these communities in some ways as a result of the fact that it's become a global issue. At the same time, there are spaces in which people are organizing. Lebanon is one place. Cairo they were, but it's gotten much more repressive for everything in Cairo. And then there are ways in which the Egyptian government kind of intermittently decides to repress like gay bars or gay, gatherings of gay men for some legitimacy purposes, right? I mean, because these are all like symbolic things, right? If they're feeling like the Islamists have an upper hand, let's go repress someone. Let's do something, let's change this divorce law just so we can get some. There's a way in which these things are quite politicized to the disadvantage of the communities. But Lebanon's Palestine too. Palestinian community has a couple of active LGBTQ organizations. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.